Good morning. So, we are at the chapter called Miss Honey's Cottage. And Matilda just did the miracle, and she showed Miss Honey, and she believed her. Amazing. Miss Honey joined Matilda outside the school gates, and the two of them walked in silence through the village streets. They walked past the green grocer, with his window full of apples and oranges, and the butcher with the bloody lumps of meat on display, and the naked chickens hanging up, and the small bank, and the grocery store, and the electrical shop. And then they came out the other side of the village to a narrow country road where there were no people anymore, and very few motor cars. And now they were alone. Matilda all of a sudden became wildly animated. It seemed as though a valve had burst inside her, and a great gush of energy was being released. She trotted beside Miss Honey with wild little hops, and her fingers flew as if she would scatter them to the four winds, and her words went off like fireworks with terrific speed. It was Miss Honey this, and Miss Honey that, and Miss Honey, I do honestly feel I could move almost anything in the world, not just topping over a glass and little things like that. I feel I could topple tables over and chairs. Miss Honey, even when people are sitting in chairs, I think I could push them over. And bigger things, too, much bigger things than chairs and tables. I only have to take a moment to get my eyes strong, and then I can push it out, the strongness, at anything at all, so long as I am staring it hard enough. I have to stare it very hard, Miss Honey, very, very hard, and then I can feel it all happening behind my eyes, and my eyes get hot, just as though they were burning. But I don't mind in the least, Miss Honey. And this is the picture. Calm yourself down, child. Calm yourself down, Miss Honey said. Let's not get ourselves too worked up so early in the proceedings. But you do think it's interesting, don't you, Miss Honey? Oh, it's interesting, all right, Miss Honey said. It's more than interesting. But we must tread very carefully from now on, Matilda. Why must we tread carefully, Miss Honey? Because we are playing with mysterious forces, my child, that we know nothing about. I do not think they are evil. They may be good. They may even be divine. But whether or not, let us handle them carefully. These were wise words from an old wise bird, but Matilda was too steamed up to see it that way. I don't see why we have to be so careful, she said, still hopping about. I am trying to explain it to you, Miss Honey said, patiently, that we are dealing with the unknown. It is an unexplainable thing. The right word for it is a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon. I'm a phenomenon, Matilda asked. It is quite possible that you are, Miss Honey said, but I'd rather you didn't think that about yourself or anything in particular for the moment. What I thought is we might explore this phenomenon a little bit further, just the two of us together, but making sure that we take things very carefully all the time. You want me to do some more of them, Miss Honey? That's what I am tempted to suggest, Miss Honey said cautiously. Oh, good, Matilda said, smiling. I myself, Miss Honey said, am probably far more bellowed over by what you did than you are, and I am trying to find some reasonable explanation. Such as what? Matilda asked. Such as whether or not it's got something to do with the fact that you are exceptionally bright. Well, what does that mean? Matilda said. That you are very, very smart. It is called a precocious child, Miss Honey said. It is one that shows amazing intelligence early on. You are an unbelievably precocious child. Am I really? Matilda asked. Oh, of course you are. You must be aware of that. Look at your reading. Look at your mathematics. I suppose you're right, Matilda said. Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of self-consciousness. I can't help but wondering, she said, whether this sudden ability has just come to you, of being able to move objects without touching them, or whether it was something you've always been able to do with your brain power. You mean there might not be room in my head for all those brains, so sometimes something has to be pushed out? That's not really what I'm saying, Miss Honey said, smiling. But whatever happens, and I say it again, we must tread carefully from now on. I have not forgotten the strange and distant glimmer on your face when you tipped over the glass. Do you think doing it could hurt me? Is that what you're thinking, Miss Honey? It made you feel pretty particular, didn't it? Peculiar. It made you feel pretty peculiar, didn't it? It made me feel lovely, Matilda said. For a moment or two I was flying past the stars on silver wings. I told you that. And shall I tell you something else, Miss Honey? It was easier the second time. Much, much easier. I think it's like anything else. The more you practice, the easier it gets. Miss Honey was walking so slowly that a small child could keep up with her, without trotting too fast. It was very peaceful out there, the narrow road, now that the village was behind them. It was one of those golden autumn afternoons, and there were blackberries and splashes of old man's beard in the hedges, and the hawthorn berries were ripening scarlet for the birds when the cold winter came along. There were tall trees here and on either side, oak and sycamore, and ash, and occasionally a sweet chestnut. Miss Honey, wishing to change the subject for a moment, gave the names of all of these to Matilda, and taught her how to recognize them by shape and by their leaves and patterns on the bark of their trunks. Matilda took all of this in and stored the knowledge away carefully in her mind. They came finally to a gap in the hedge on the left-hand side of the road, where there was a 5 on the gate. This way, Miss Honey said, and she opened the gate and led Matilda through, and closed it again. They were now walking along a narrow lane, and that was no more than a rutted cart track. There was a high hedge of hazel on either side, and you could see clusters of ripe brown nuts on their green jackets. The squirrels would be collecting them very soon, Miss Honey said, and storing them away for the bleak months ahead. You mean they live down there? Matilda asked. You mean you live down there? Matilda asked. I do, Miss Honey replied, but she said no more. Matilda had not once stopped to think about where Miss Honey might be living. She had always regarded her purely as a teacher, a person who turned up out of nowhere and taught at school and then went away. Do any of us children, she wondered, ever stop to ask ourselves where our teachers go when school is over for the day? Do we wonder if they live alone, or is there a mother at home, or a sister, or a husband? Do you live all by yourself, Miss Honey? She asked. Yes, Miss Honey said, very much so. They were walking over the deep sun-baked mud tracks of the lane, and you had to watch where you put your feet if you didn't want to twist your ankle. There were a few small birds around in the hazel branches, but that was all. It's just a farm laborer cottage, Miss Honey said. You mustn't expect too much. We're nearly there. They came to a small green gate half buried in the hedges on the right and almost hidden by the overhanging hazel branches. Miss Honey paused with one hand on the gate and said, There it is. That's where I live. Matilda saw a narrow path leading to a tiny, and this is what I'm going to show you. That's them walking. Red brick cottage. I'm just going to show you the picture now. The cottage was so small it looked more like a doll's house than a human's dwelling. The brick it was built of were old and crumbly and very pale red. It had a gray slate roof and one small chimney, and there were 2 little windows at the front. Each window was no longer than a sheet of newspaper, and there was clearly no upstairs to the place. On either side of the path there was a wilderness of nettles and blackberry thorns and long brown grass. An enormous oak tree stood overshadowing the cottage. Its massive spreading branches seemed to be enfolded and embracing the tiny building, and perhaps hiding it as well from the rest of the world. Miss Honey, with one hand on the gate, which she had not opened yet, turned to Matilda and said, "A poet called Dylan Thomas once wrote some lines that I think of every time I walk up this path." Matilda waited. Miss Honey, in a rather wonderful slow voice, began reciting the poem. "Never another, my girl riding far and near, in the land of the hearthstone tales, and spelled asleep. Fear or believe that the wolf in the sheep white hood, looping and beating roughly and blithely shall leap, my dear, out of a lair, in the flocked leaves, in the dew-dipped year, to eat your heart in the house is the rosy wood." There was a moment of silence, and Matilda had never before heard great romantic poetry spoken aloud. It was profound and moved her. "It's like music," she whispered. "It is music," Miss Honey said, and then, as though embarrassed at having revealed such a secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate and walked up the path. Matilda hung back. She was a bit frightened of this place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic, and so totally away from this earth. It was like an illusion. It was like an illustration in the Grimms or Hans Andersen. It was the house where the poor woodcutter lived with Hansel and Gretel, and where Miss Riding Hood and where Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived. And it was also the house of the 7 dwarfs and the 3 bears and all the rest of them. It was straight out of a fairy tale. "Come along, my dear," Miss Honey said, calling back, and Matilda following her up the path. The front door was covered in flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the hatch and opened the door and went in. Although she was not a tall woman, she had to stoop down low to get through the doorway. Matilda went in after her and found herself in what seemed to be a dark, narrow tunnel. "You can come through the kitchen and help me make some tea," Miss Honey said, and she led the way through the tunnel to the kitchen. That is, if you could call it a kitchen. It was not much bigger than a good-sized cloth cupboard, and there were small windows in the back wall with a sink under it. There were no taps over the sink. Against another wall there was a shelf, presumably for preparing food, and there was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf itself there stood a stove, a saucepan, and half a bottle of milk. A primus is a little camping stove that you fill with paraffin and you light at the top, and then you pump it to get the pressure right for the flame. So meaning she clearly doesn't have a lot of money because she can't afford a real stove. "You can get me some water while I light the primus," Miss Honey said. "The well is out at the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll find a rope in the well. Just hook the bucket on the end. Here. The picture." Alright, this is a long chapter 2, so I might stop in a minute. And the next chapter is really good. I like the next one a lot. Oh, switch the page. Alright. Matilda became more bemused than ever now, and took the bucket and carried it out to the back of the garden. The well had a little wooden roof over it, and a simple winding device that there was a rope dangling down to the bottomless hole. Matilda pulled up the rope and hooked the handle of the bucket to the end. Then she lowered it until she heard a splash and the rope went slack. She pulled it up again, and lo and behold, there was water in the bucket. "Is this enough?" she asked, carrying it in. "Just about," Miss Honey said. "I don't suppose you've ever done that before." "Never," Matilda said. "It was fun. How do you get enough water for your bath?" "I don't take a bath," Miss Honey said. "I wash standing up. I get a bucket full of water, and I heat it over this little stove, and I strip and wash myself all over." "Do you honestly do that?" Matilda asked. "Of course I do," Miss Honey said. "Every poor person in England used to wash this way until not very long ago. And they didn't have a primus. They had to heat the water over fire." "Are you poor, Miss Honey?" Matilda asked. "Yes," Miss Honey said. "Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it?" The primus was roaring away with a powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard, and she put some tea leaves into it. She also found half of a small loaf of brown bread. She got 2 thin slices, and then from a plastic container she took some margarine and spread it on the butter. Margarine, Matilda thought. She really must be poor. So there's a thing, I don't know if this is nowadays or in America, but if you don't get real butter, that means that you don't have money. But I'm not sure if that's correct in our society, but it is clearly for them. Miss Honey found a tray on it, and she put 2 mugs, the teapot, a half bottle of milk, and a plate with 2 slices of bread. "I'm afraid I don't have any sugar," she said. "I never use it." "Oh, that's all right," Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and she was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion. "Let's have it back in the sitting room," Miss Honey said, picking up the tray and leading it out of the kitchen, down towards the little tunnel of a room in the front. And that's where I'm going to stop. I'm getting tired. So the next chapter, I have about 2.5 more pages of this chapter. And then the next chapter is called Miss Honey's Story. I think you're going to really find it very interesting. And you guys, we're almost done with this book. This is where we are. So I already have to start thinking of a new book. Oh, my goodness. So I will let you know about that probably next week. All right. Goodbye.